I want to share a story with you that began 4 years ago on the first day of a freshman English class I taught here at Las Positas College. As students introduced themselves, a young man sitting alone in the back of the room quietly told us that he'd been in the Army and was now working toward a college degree. For our first essay, I asked students to write a story about their lives, and I encouraged this young man, I'll call him Steve, to write about his military service. Well, he was reluctant. Although he'd been home now 2 years, in many ways, the war was not over for Steve. Every day he carried with him brutal images that seemed to control his thoughts, that he'd never shared with anyone, not with his family, not even with his wife. Steve was suffering from post-traumatic stress, PTSD, and he feared that dredging up his memories would make the condition worse. So, a few days later, though, I was surprised that Steve reconsidered. It might actually be good for him, he told me, to write about his experiences, to get them onto paper and out in the open. And so he did. Steve was 22 when he deployed to Iraq. He wrote about a day when he'd been ordered to climb into a well of water and retrieve, one by one, 3 floating bodies that had been executed: a man, a woman, and a little girl. The following day, as Steve was haunted by thoughts of that little girl, the truck he rode in triggered a roadside bomb. Here's what he wrote. The next thing I knew, I was blinded by an intense light radiating from all around us, instantly followed by a deafening blast that hurt every fiber of my being. My body was bathed in a brief but intense fire, my nose filled with dust and the scent of burning rubber. As my truck lifted into the air, my body was thrown around like a doll in a dryer. The initial blast lasted seconds but felt like a lifetime. Steve went on to describe what happened next. Before the dust could settle, explosions erupted all around my vehicle. I had to get out of the truck, which had flipped on its side. I used every ounce of strength to push open the 300-pound door. When my head lifted above the door, I could see rockets flying everywhere. I could not believe my eyes. Our convoy was under heavy attack. I spotted my gunner 15 feet away, either dead or unconscious. As I left my truck and ran to drag him to cover, I was hit by bullets 3 times in the vest, bruising a rib and cracking 3 more. Once I got my gunner to safety, I returned fire, engaging every target in front of me. It seemed like the fighting lasted for hours, but it only lasted a few minutes. These experiences, he wrote, changed him forever. It was not easy for Steve to write down his traumatic experiences. But after he did, he felt relief because he'd shared the details and he'd put them into a story that he could step back and observe. And Steve's story affected me so deeply that I asked his permission to publish it in a newspaper column that I was writing at the time. He agreed because he wanted readers to see what happens when we send our young people to war. Like many veterans, Steve expressed the view that most Americans aren't interested in what took place in the Middle East. After all, these conflicts happened over there. These wars are officially over. It shouldn't be surprising that the gap between veterans and civilians is wider now than it's ever been. Less than 0.5% of the American population serves in the military, compared to 12% in World War II. So while we honor those who serve, few of us know how to connect with these men and women who have made sacrifices, have deferred their college educations and careers, and in many ways led a warrior life so different from our own. And what happens when they come home? Consider these facts. Whether they served overseas or here in the United States, almost all veterans struggle in their transition from military to civilian life. At least 1 in 3 post-9/11 veterans suffers from some level of post-traumatic stress or traumatic brain injury. Every day, an average of 22 veterans commit suicide. Around the time Steve was writing about his military service, I later learned a veteran was creating a national writing program in Washington, D.C. This is Ron Capps, founder of the Veterans Writing Project. Capps nearly committed suicide and credits writing with saving his life. He now teaches veterans what he himself learned, that either you control the memory or the memory controls you. These traumatic memories never go away, But writing about trauma does diminish their intensity. Writing is not a substitute for therapy or medication, but writing allows us to make sense of our lives. And it allows us to express what is often too difficult to say when speaking about the experience. Another veteran, a Marine who became a journalist, David Morris, has written a history of PTSD. Like Steve, Morris was nearly killed by a roadside bomb. In his book, The Evil Hours, he writes that in the wake of trauma, the mind craves meaningful facts, which become the raw materials to shape and tell a story. He quotes the author Isak Dinesen, who wrote that all sorrows can be born if you put them in a story or tell a story about them. My growing interest in the value of writing about trauma led to developing a course for veterans 2 years ago, part of a new program our college offers in engineering technology. Along with instruction in technical writing, students write in journals about their military service, culminating in a personal narrative. I love teaching this course. I learn something new every time I step into the classroom, and I'm pretty sure by the end of the semester, the students have taught me more than I've taught them. Students have a great sense of humor, these veterans, and I enjoy encouraging them to write and share their stories. And the students tell me that they enjoy the class. The first cohort created a website where we now publish the stories of student veterans who attend our college. As word of the program spread around campus, a combat veteran who was here on campus and yet was not in the class, Jeremy Taylor. Jeremy proposed that we celebrate Veterans Day by inviting local community members to come up here to campus and hear some of these veterans read their stories. It was a great idea. And I told Jeremy we would do it on one condition. He had to write his story and read it that evening. And he did. He wrote an amazing story with a powerful message for both veterans and civilians. And I hope you'll take the time to read his story along with the others that are published on our Las Positas College website. Jeremy joined his fellow service members, and together they read their stories right here in this theater to an audience of 135 people. The final reader that evening was Frankie Stoneham. Frankie joined the military when she was 19. Her story recounts the sexual abuse that she encountered during her military service. As she tried to manage her subsequent years of emotional ups and downs through prescription drugs and alcohol, her life spiraled out of control. Bearing witness to her truth, Frankie spared no detail as she shared her story with us and found the courage to do so. Finally, through therapy, through her faith, and through enrolling in college, Frankie has regained control of her life for herself and for her daughter. At the end of her talk, the audience gave her a standing ovation. Frankie has said that every veteran has a voice and every veteran has a story. She recently told me that sharing her story that evening was an important step in gaining freedom from her trauma. Frankie and her fellow service members have taught me that each of them has a desire to continue their mission of service in a meaningful way. Through their military training, veterans have work experience, discipline, and skills that are transferable to civilian professions. And yet the gap remains between civilians and returning service members. So how can we close that gap? This is a question I recently asked my classroom of veterans. Here's what they told me. Despite their transition difficulties, and while they appreciate donations to organizations that support veterans, they don't want us to feel sorry for them. After all, they volunteered to go into the military, and they're proud of their service. They never want to be asked the question, did you kill anyone? This is an inappropriate and deeply personal question. The students came up with 3 questions that civilians could ask a veteran to begin a conversation. The first question is, what branch of the military did you serve in? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guards, National Guards. Veterans are very fiercely loyal to their particular branch. The next question, where did you serve? Many veterans did serve overseas, but many veterans did a fine job serving their country right here in the United States. And finally, what was your job in the military? What duties did you perform? What were you responsible for? One of the students in the class, a Marine who had seen combat in both Iraq and Afghanistan, he said, you know, you can tell by how a veteran answers these questions if they want to keep talking. If they seem comfortable talking, you might encourage them to share more of their story. For those veterans, like Steve, Jeremy, and Frankie, we can do more than say, thank you for your service. We have the opportunity to build community through our empathy, and by serving as what psychologist Alice Miller has called being an enlightened witness. To illustrate the importance of this role, and because I began my talk with the story of one veteran's journey, I'd like to conclude with the story of all veterans. In my class, I asked students to write about how their lives mirror the stages of what's known in the study of literature as the hero's journey. Over thousands of years, in every civilization, almost every story ever told has a protagonist whose journey follows the same set of steps. For both the protagonist and the veteran, the journey begins in everyday life. Then comes a call to adventure. As the hero answers the call, he undergoes training and preparation. He travels to a foreign land where he encounters obstacles and enemies. He faces a road of trials, and he faces his deepest fears. In every story, the hero emerges victorious, but often with a wound from which he never fully recovers. As the journey nears its end, the hero returns home, but often longs to return to that foreign land where life had purpose and meaning. The final stage of the hero's journey takes place when the hero gains a new sense of self by sharing what he or she has learned with their community. As enlightened witnesses, you and I, we are that community. Every veteran has a voice, and every veteran has a story. And I'm not just talking about post-9/11 veterans. I'm talking about all service members, including those who served in Vietnam, many of whom were shunned when they came home, and many of whom have yet to tell their stories. You and I, as everyday citizens, we play an important role in each veteran's story. This is how we close that gap, through our empathy, through listening, by inviting veterans to bear witness to their truth and encouraging them to share their story. Thank you.